Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about pee. Yes, you heard that right. So dim the lights, settle in, grab a drink, preferably not yellow, and get cozy. Because tonight, we're drifting back to a time when medical science was less science and more educated guesswork wrapped in mysticism and urine jars. Welcome to another long, slow descent into the weird corners of history. This one's called Why Were Medieval Doctors Obsessed with Urine? And by the end of this, you'll understand why your friendly local physician from the year 1350 could tell your humors were out of balance just by sniffing your chamber pot. So let's begin. The Golden Age of Guesswork. In medieval Europe, medicine was basically a mixture of philosophy, astrology, and vague hopes. If you were sick, people didn't really think about germs or infections because, well, they didn't know those existed. Instead, they believed your health depended on the balance of four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And if any of those went out of balance, congratulations, you were ill. Now, how would you tell which humor was misbehaving? Well, that's where urine came in. Because urine, in the medieval imagination, was like the body's daily report card. A direct message from your inner organs, conveniently delivered in liquid form. Doctors believed that by looking at it, smelling it, and occasionally, yes, tasting it, they could tell what was wrong with you. And if you're already feeling uncomfortable, just know this was a full-blown science. There were charts, diagrams, and color wheels. They even had special glass flasks called machulas, round-bottomed, long-necked bottles made specifically to hold urine for inspection. Imagine you walk into your doctor's office today, and instead of asking for blood work, they just hold your sample up to the light and go. Ah yes, slightly frothy, your spleen is clearly anxious. That's the kind of medicine we're dealing with tonight, when pee was the diagnostic tool of choice. By the 12th century, this practice even had a fancy name: uroscopy. It came from Greek roots meaning to look at urine, which is refreshingly literal. Doctors would spend years studying the art of uroscopy, learning how to interpret color, clarity, smell, even how the bubbles settled. According to their medical logic, every shade meant something. Pale and clear meant your body was cold and damp, probably too much phlegm. Deep yellow meant heat in the body, maybe too much bile. Reddish or rusty, you were overheating. Brown or black, time to call a priest. Some doctors even described sparkling urine as a sign of fever, and cloudy urine as a sign your digestion was off. It was less medicine, more like trying to interpret tea leaves but grosser. And to be fair, sometimes they weren't completely wrong. Certain diseases do affect urine color and smell. But they didn't know why. They just assumed your organs were like a furnace with bad coal. The matula, the medieval crystal ball. Let's talk about the matula, that famous glass flask. If you were a doctor, it was your ultimate fashion accessory. You'd hang it from your belt, carry it to house calls, or proudly display it in portraits, because it screamed educated and mysterious. Like a medieval stethoscope, except instead of listening to heartbeats, you were peering into pee. A matula usually had a rounded body and a long, narrow neck. This allowed doctors to see how the clouds, or sediments, formed when urine settled. The layers were thought to represent different parts of the body. Top equals head, middle equals chest, bottom equals lower organs. So if the top looked foggy, your brain was disturbed. If the middle was murky, your heart was troubled. And if the bottom was dark, your liver or kidneys were acting up. It's poetic in a way, turning pee into a miniature model of the human body. Deeply unscientific, yes, but beautifully confident. Pee as a medieval status symbol. Now, surprisingly, urine wasn't just for doctors. It became part of everyday conversation about health. Aristocrats would send servants on horseback to deliver a flask of urine to the nearest physician, sometimes across cities. The doctor didn't even need to see the patient, just the sample. That's how powerful the myth was. In some cases, the doctor never met the sick person at all. They'd simply look at the bottle, sniff, swirl, and write a letter back with instructions like, add leeches twice daily, also pray more. Imagine Amazon Prime delivery, but for pee. When doctors had to taste it. Yes, unfortunately, this part is true. Not all doctors did it, but some absolutely did. There are references to physicians tasting urine to detect sweetness, an early, unintentional way of diagnosing diabetes. They called it honey urine. If it tasted sweet, they knew the patient was losing sugar. So yes, somewhere in the 14th century, a man with a long robe, a beard, and a fancy degree was swirling a spoonful of your pee like a sommelier, and probably muttering notes of barley and despair. This apparently was respectable science. The church's complicated relationship with bodily fluids. You might think the church would have a problem with all this sniffing and sipping. And you'd be right, sort of. Medicine in medieval Europe lived under the shadow of religion. Healing was seen as a mix of divine will and physical balance. So while monks and scholars practiced medicine, there were constant debates over whether too much worldly curiosity, like staring into urine, was sinful. But since monasteries were basically the hospitals of their day, they quietly allowed it. After all, if the Lord could send signs through the stars, surely he could send a few through your bladder. The uroscopy wheel, because why not make it fancy? By the late Middle Ages, physicians developed something called the uroscopy wheel, a chart showing all the shades and meanings of urine. Think of it as a medieval color palette, ranging from pale lemon to muddy brown, with cheerful captions like, bright yellow, excess heat, dull gray, melancholy, blackish, death approaching. It was part medical manual, part astrology chart, and 100% nonsense. But it looked impressive, which mattered a lot in a world where doctors competed with astrologers and herbalists for clients. Owning a fancy urine chart was like owning a diploma. And showing it off said, yes, I'm a learned man who knows his bodily fluids. When P met astrology. Speaking of astrology, oh yes, they mixed those two. Because in the Middle Ages, everything was connected. Your urine's appearance wasn't just about your organs. It could be influenced by the stars. A doctor might check the moon phase before diagnosing you, because maybe your bile was acting up under Aries. It sounds absurd, but that was medicine's vibe, cosmic pee analysis. Pee as a commodity. Urine had other uses too. It was valuable, literally. People used it for cleaning clothes, tanning leather, bleaching hair, and even making gunpowder. The ammonia content made it useful in chemistry, long before chemistry was a thing. So yes, medieval life involved a lot more pee than anyone asked for. Buckets of it stored in households, sold in markets. Your chamber pot was practically a multi-tool. But tonight, we're mostly concerned with its medical role, because that's where things get weirdly intimate. House calls the medieval way. Imagine you're living in a small English village in the year 1375. You wake up feeling terrible. Your stomach hurts, your head spins, and your neighbor swears it's too much black bile. You or your servant, if you're fancy, collect a jar of urine and rush to the local physician. He's wearing a long robe, probably red or green, with fur trim to show off his status. On his table sit several matulas, gently glowing with different shades of yellow under candlelight. He lifts your sample to the light, tilts his head, and says in Latin something like, "Ah, the color of ripe wheat. Clearly, your liver is melancholic." You nod solemnly, You have no idea what that means. He prescribes some herbs, maybe a bloodletting session, and reminds you to pray. You leave feeling oddly reassured, because someone just stared at your bodily fluids and seemed very confident about it. Medicine, but make it guesswork. To modern minds, medieval uroscopy sounds ridiculous. But at the time, it was cutting edge. Most physicians didn't have access to anatomy studies. Human dissection was rare and controversial. So pee was the closest they could get to seeing what was happening inside you. And for all its absurdity, it did teach some observational habits, noting color changes, linking symptoms to bodily functions, and the idea that fluids could reveal disease. In a way, it was the ancestor of modern urinalysis, minus the candlelight and the tasting part. Famous pee enthusiast. A few medieval doctors became famous for their work in uroscopy. There was Theophilus Protospatarius, a Byzantine physician who wrote on urines around the 7th century. He classified pee colors into dozens of shades, describing their spiritual and physical meanings with the seriousness of a man grading gemstones. Then came Isaac Judius, a 9th century Arab Jewish physician whose book De Urinis became standard reading in medieval medical schools. His work was so influential it was copied, translated, and quoted for centuries, usually without any understanding of what he actually meant. And let's not forget Galen, the ultimate medical authority for over 1,000 years. He's the guy who turned humoral theory into the backbone of medieval medicine. If Galen said bile was too warm, then by God, it was too warm. P. Gender and class. Interestingly, how your urine was interpreted could depend on who you were. Doctors tended to describe noble urine in more elegant terms: subtle, refined, delicate in vapors. Meanwhile, peasant samples were thick, gross, or earthy. Science and classism, hand in hand. As for women, things got even more complicated. Doctors believed female bodies were colder and moister, obviously, because sexism had to be included somewhere. So their urine was often interpreted as more watery, representing the supposed emotional instability of women. Truly a groundbreaking field. From monks to merchants. By the late Middle Ages, medicine had moved beyond monasteries. University-trained doctors, especially in Italy and France, made urine analysis a key part of their professional identity. Some even included it in their coats of arms, yes, literally featuring a glass flask. Because nothing says trustworthy physician like a golden bottle of symbolic pee. Pee and prognosis. Uroscopy wasn't just about diagnosing, it was also about predicting the future. Doctors claimed they could tell whether you'd live or die just by observing your urine's behavior over time. If it cleared up, good news. If it darkened or thickened, your vital spirit was fatting. It was medieval fortune-telling, but instead of reading palms, they were reading pee. And surprisingly, patients believed it wholeheartedly. Because what else could you do? When you don't understand disease, you trust the guy with the jar and the Latin vocabulary. Let's take a slow breath here. We've been staring into too many golden flasks. But don't worry, in Part 2, we'll glide a little deeper into the strange world of medieval medicine itself. The universities, the rituals, the superstitions, and how doctors defended their obsession with urine right up until the dawn of modern science. Because apparently, when you're confident enough, even pee can sound profound. You're still here, which means somehow you're voluntarily listening to me talk about urine for another half hour. Good choice. Let's take another slow breath and drift into the dimly lit, incense-filled halls of the medieval university, where men in long robes argued in Latin about things they'd never tested, and where pee finally earned its doctorate. From monks to medical scholars, In the early Middle Ages, healing was still mostly done by monks, midwives, and herbalists. But around the 12th century, universities like Bologna, Paris, and Salerno began formalizing medical education. Medicine suddenly became academic. And that meant lots of books, no actual patients, and the deeply held belief that Aristotle and Galen were right about everything, always. At the University of Salerno, often called the first true medical school in Europe, students were trained to read and memorize the canon of medicine by Avicenna. Avicenna was a Persian genius who believed urine could reveal the body's inner harmony. So of course the European doctors copied that part, with enthusiasm. If Avicenna said urine could predict illness, then clearly it could. And no one dared to disagree, because disagreeing meant failing your exam. How to graduate in P studies. Imagine being a student in 1250. You've spent years memorizing Latin medical texts. You've studied the humors, astrology, and which saints to pray to for constipation. And finally, you're ready for your big test. Your professor, an old man with ink-stained hands, places a matula in front of you. Inside, a lukewarm sample of something yellow and suspicious. He asks, "Tell me, Master Thomas, what say you of this urine?" And you answer with great confidence. Yellow clear with moderate bubbles. The patient's bile is strong, yet his digestion is good. He shall recover in 3 days. Everyone nods. You pass with honors. Congratulations. You're now officially qualified to sniff strangers for a living. P and paperwork. Medical texts of the period were full of urine diagrams. Scribes and illustrators spent days painting beautiful circles of gold and ochre to represent various urine shades. Sometimes they'd even draw little bubbles in sediment layers, because accuracy matters, obviously. These were copied again and again through the centuries, passed from scholar to scholar. By the 14th century, every medical reference book had a chapter titled something like De Urinis Humanis, on human urine. Some even had poetry, because why not make your diagnostic guide rhyme? Diagnosis by Flask, the doctor's branding strategy. Now, in an age before advertising, a physician's best marketing tool was his appearance. A good doctor had to look learned, composed, and slightly mystical. And nothing said, "I know things," like walking around with a glass flask of urine. It became part of the iconography of medicine, just like the snake and staff. Painters began including the matula in portraits of doctors. Even when the physician was clearly doing nothing useful, the flask made him look wise. There's a famous 15th century illustration showing a doctor holding up a matula toward a candle, staring into it like he's gazing at the secrets of the universe. The patient in the corner looks skeptical. But hey, it was tradition. The secret code of color. To a modern eye, medieval urine charts look like abstract art. To doctors, they were serious business. There were, believe it or not, 20 main colors of urine described in medical texts, each with its own meaning. Here's a taste, not literally, thankfully. 1 pale white, cold stomach, weak digestion. 2 lemon yellow, moderate health. 3 golden yellow, warm and dry, possibly fever. 4 reddish orange, excessive heat, blood imbalance. 5 brownish red, choleric corruption, which is medieval for you're not doing great. 6 greenish, liver distress or supernatural causes. 7 blackish, terminal illness. There were also notes about smell, sweet, rank, earthy, fishy. You can imagine how charming that laboratory smelled after a few hours. P. Prophets and charlatans. As with any pseudoscience, once something gains popularity, the fraudsters arrive. By the 14th century, Europe was full of wandering urine readers, unlicensed healers who'd show up in markets and offer instant diagnoses. They'd claim to read your future, by holding your sample to the light. It was basically astrology with extra steps. Doctors hated them. They called them piss prophets. Yes, that's the actual term used in some records. The insult caught on. University-trained physicians spent decades trying to separate themselves from these street quacks. They argued that they practiced real uroscopy, while the piss prophets were just showmen. But to the average villager, they looked identical. They both carried jars and spoke gibberish. The great debate: should you diagnose without seeing the patient? One of the strangest medieval controversies was whether it was ethical to diagnose someone just by their urine. Some doctors insisted it was perfectly fine. The urine told all. Others argued you needed to at least see the patient. A few radicals even suggested touching the patient's pulse or looking at their tongue. Wild stuff. In 1322, the faculty at the University of Paris had to issue a formal statement. Uroscopy alone was not enough for a full diagnosis. You had to examine the person too. But of course, that didn't stop anyone. Mail-order P diagnosis remained popular for centuries. It's the medieval version of WebMD. You send your symptoms, get a confident but mostly useless answer, and still feel oddly reassured. P as symbol and metaphor. In art and literature, urine became a symbol of both knowledge and deception. Medieval satirists mocked doctors constantly, portraying them as pompous men staring at bottles while patients died beside them. There's even a 14th century English poem that jokes. He gazed long into the glass and found the cause was wind and gas. Poetry was savage back then, but these jokes show how common uroscopy was. Everyone recognized it instantly. The image of a doctor squinting at a bottle became shorthand for quackery. And yet, real doctors kept doing it. Because it looked professional. And because, frankly, there weren't better tools yet. P and the plague. When the Black Death hit Europe in the 14th century, people were desperate for answers. Doctors with limited tools and a deep fear of catching the plague themselves relied heavily on, you guessed it, urine. They wrote entire plague treatises describing what plague urine looked like. One popular belief was that plague victims had thin, pale urine with little sediment. Of course, this didn't actually help anyone survive, but it gave doctors a sense of control in a world that felt cursed. And to be fair, if your job is to diagnose the deadliest pandemic in history using only glass bottles and astrology, you'd cling to any method you had. When religion and P collided, by the late Middle Ages, some theologians started questioning whether diagnosing by urine was meddling with divine secrets. Because if God made you ill, maybe he didn't want you to peek inside the plan via a flask. Most doctors shrugged this off. They insisted they weren't reading the future, only observing the signs given by nature, which conveniently kept them out of trouble with the church. Still, there are recorded sermons warning believers not to place faith in bottles. Good advice, honestly. The Renaissance upgrade, fancy P. Fast forward to the Renaissance, 15th and 16th centuries, and everything's getting a little more elegant. Art is blooming, kings are commissioning portraits, and yes, physicians are still inspecting urine. But now the process has props. Silver trays, velvet cloths, candlelight. Doctors began turning urine analysis into performance art. One 16th century German physician even designed custom P spectacles, tinted lenses to help him see subtle color variations. It's ridiculous and yet oddly impressive, because nothing says dedicated professional like inventing fashion accessories for P. P in the age of printing. With the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, uroscopy got a PR boost. Suddenly, pamphlets about urine colors were everywhere. Some were aimed at doctors, others at curious laypeople. A few even became bestsellers, like the Urinal of Physic, a 16th century English guidebook explaining what your pee says about your soul. People loved these things. They used them like early self-diagnosis manuals. You could look up your urine color and decide whether you were dying or just slightly melancholic. So yes, medieval Europe invented the first home medical chart. And it was all about pee, the slow fade of uroscopy. Eventually, science caught up. By the 17th century, new discoveries about circulation, anatomy, and infection began to chip away at the old humoral model. Doctors like William Harvey started talking about blood flow. Antony van Leeuwenhoek was peering through microscopes at tiny organisms. And slowly, the idea that disease came from imbalanced bile started to sound a bit silly. Uroscopy didn't vanish overnight, though. It lingered as a diagnostic side habit, sort of like how your grandmother still swears by home remedies, just in case. Even in the 18th century, some physicians still carried matulas to house calls. Old habits die hard. When pee finally got scientific, ironically, the basic idea behind uroscopy, that urine reflects internal health, turned out to be right. They just got the reason wrong. By the 19th century, chemists discovered ways to test urine for sugar, proteins, and other compounds. And suddenly, the ancient pee obsession became legitimate science. Modern urinalysis owes its entire existence to centuries of medieval guesswork. So next time you do a urine test at a clinic, just remember you're participating in an 800-year-old tradition. Minus the robe, and hopefully minus the sniffing. Pee in pop culture because it never dies. Even after medicine moved on, the image of the medieval doctor with a flask lived on in jokes, plays, and paintings. You can still find 17th century caricatures of pompous doctors holding up urine bottles, looking wise and smug. They became the symbol of outdated authority, the guy who sounds confident but understands nothing. Which, let's be honest, makes them timeless. Why the obsession lasted so long? So, why did this bizarre practice last nearly a millennium? A few reasons. 1, it looked empirical. Doctors could see and touch something from the body, which made their work seem scientific, even if it was. 2, it was safe. No dissections, no surgery, no infections, just bottles. 3, it flattered the patient. People liked the idea that their bodies held hidden messages, that their urine revealed their unique humoral signature. 4, and frankly, nobody had better tools. When you don't have microscopes or lab tests, pee is as good as it gets. The quiet beauty of it all. As funny as it seems, there's something almost poetic about this obsession. In a world of mystery and superstition, medieval doctors were trying to understand the human body. They looked into whatever clues nature offered, even if those clues came in a bottle of yellow liquid. They were wrong, yes, but they were curious. And that curiosity, misguided though it was, laid the first fragile stones on the long path toward real science. Let's drift here for a moment. The candles in our imaginary university flicker low. Students pack their scrolls. Somewhere, a physician tucks away his beloved matula for the night, satisfied that he's glimpsed the secrets of the soul through someone's bladder. Strange but kind of beautiful,